Welcome everyone. Today we're comparing the 24-120 f4 Z lens to 3 of my f-mount Nikon lenses. I have, starting off, the 35 Sigma Art 35 1.4, and then I have the 85 1.8G Nikon lens, and then I have as well the 105 2.8 macro lens. And we're gonna compare all of these lenses to one another, and we're gonna see whether or not this lens can beat out most of the older vintage lenses. One thing that particularly interests me is exactly how well the autofocus does on these f-mount lenses compared to the 24-120. The 24-120 just uses a STM motor, but Nikon really has dialed in their autofocus. So I'm using right now the Sigma Art 35 1.4. Let's just see exactly how well this locks on to me when moving up close, and if it can hang with the Nikon 24-120. When looking at the two FTZ mounts, the difference between the two is that the FTZ1 has just a tripod mount, so it's really not too much of a difference. This FTZ2 is just a little more smaller profiled, so that's something to keep in mind. I would probably aim for the FTZ1 adapter if you're wanting to mount a really large tripod lens. Let's move over now to the Nikon 24-120 and let's see how the autofocus compares with that lens. I should mention as well, I am shooting this at 3.5 on the Sigma Art right now. So let's move over to f4 on the 24-120. So now we're on the 24-120, and this lens performs really well, like all the Z glass. Even though it has this STM motor in it, you really can't tell, and it performs very similarly to a lot of linear designed lenses. So it's pretty impressive what Nikon's been able to do, and this really seems to hold autofocus quite well and has really great close focusing too. So when you're using this lens in the field, you really don't have to worry at all about autofocus. Just turning it on to, like, say, people detect and just auto area, it should be good enough as long as you're the only subject in the scene. Now let's move this over now to, let's say, 85, and let's see how well it tracks me here. All right, so the 24-120 now is at 85 millimeters. Let's just see exactly how well this performs, and we're gonna compare it to the 85 1.8G lens that I have. Close focusing should get a little bit better. Don't mind me if I have any snot in my nose. It's getting cold out here as of recent. Let's move over to the Nikon. Okay, so now we're on the 85 1.8G. Let's just see how well this performs. I've noticed in some comparisons that this 85G actually is quite a bit faster than the 85Z, but also the transitions are maybe not as nice, and this doesn't have that great of minimum focus on it, but looks like it's doing a pretty good job tracking me. I can see it does hesitate a little bit when I start to go back, so it's not locking on to me completely throughout the transition of me moving, but it's doing a pretty darn good job. Let's move on now to the 105 2.8 macro, and let's see how that looks. All right, so we have the 105 2.8 macro here, and this actually is a pretty decent lens for autofocus. It does somewhat decent. It's maybe not as fast as the 1.8G, but in my test just doing photography, looks like it performed okay. Right now I'm seeing that it tracks me quite well, and this is a lens that has really nice color to it. Now this lens has a 2.8 aperture on it when shooting. Depending on the magnification that it's at, you can expect the lens to shoot somewhat closer to f4 at times. There's a lot of really great things going for this 105mm 2.8 macro lens. It has VR, It's a heavy beast, but it has really nice image quality with some flaring, but you really buy this lens for its macro capability. The 24-120 also has pretty good macro-like abilities, being able to focus down to 0.35 meters. It's really no slouch in that department either, especially if you pair that with something like a macro tube. So let's do some comparisons now and see exactly how well both these compare in the macro world. Okay, we're looking at the 105 2.8 macro right now, and we're at infinity. Let's dial it back, manually focusing, and it's really nice and smooth on this lens, but obviously there's a massive amount of focus breathing. But look at that. This is at the minimum focus distance of 0.314, it says. 1-to-1 lifelike macro range. Okay, we're at infinity right now with a 24-120. Let's manually focus the lens to see exactly how close we can get. Obviously, that's a much smoother amount of breathing on this lens. It's next to none, which is really impressive with this range. This 24-120 is an absolute monster when it comes to video work, especially having the one to do it all. Looking at now the 85 1.8G. These are all shot at f8, by the way. Quite a bit of focus breathing. This is a really nice lens. I really like the colors out of this one. It's not overly sharp, has a good amount of character to it. But certainly not a macro lens with the minimum focus distance of 0.8 meters. Not ideal for this sort of work. Let's look at the Sigma Art now. Okay, now on to the 35 1.4, and this has a pretty impressive close focus distance of 0.3 meters. So this looks pretty decent. Manually focusing it by hand looks okay. Let's try now in autofocus. Having some trouble here autofocusing it at this region. Now that's one of the issues you really will run into when trying to use these older lenses and pairing it with autofocus. It really can give you a bit of trouble here. There we go. I was able to do it that time. It's just not consistent like it is with the 24-120. It's working though. Sometimes. I think I'm just at the point where it's like maybe a little bit too close. It's really having trouble. Now it's racking back and forth. A little hesitant, honestly, but it is sort of working. Definitely would be doing manual focus pulls with this one if you can. I think it's gonna allow you to achieve much greater results. Before we switch out to Sigma Art, I believe it's important to also show the benefits of this 1.4 aperture. Just looking at the image right now, it really has a nice bokeh background, and that's not something you're going to be able to get with the 24-120. So despite it weighing even more by a considerable amount than the 24-120, you're getting a lot more from having something that goes down to 1.4. Looking at this 24-120 now and the background blur that it offers, honestly at 120 millimeters, it's really impressive, the sort of blur that you get. Now this is 35 millimeters. Still pretty nice. I still think that the Sigma Art wins pretty good amount, but yeah, once you start zooming that lens in, if you're talking about just having one to do it all, you get even more blur with this 24-120 at the 120 range. Pretty impressive stuff. So if you're worried about not being able to get creamy bokeh this lens will be able to do it for you. Looking at the 24 to 120, this is pretty good for vlogging. It's at 35 millimeters right now, but obviously it goes down to 24, and this covers most of my body. Pretty ideal setup for this. It is a little heavy though, but the Sigma Art that we're going to be switching to in a second is much heavier and would be much more tiring on your arms. So this wins in that sense. I'm shooting at f4. Now let's switch over now to the Sigma Art, and let's see now, comparing these two between the 35 millimeter, what looks better for a vlogging setup. Okay, so we're on the Tamron now, and we're at 1.4, and this is the benefit of having a 1.4 lens. Obviously, the depth of field you get with it is pretty impressive. Overall, looks pretty good. Focuses quite well, but yeah, there's definitely that whirring sort of sound from the motor's autofocusing compared to the Nikon that is totally silent. There's definitely a difference with that. Let's move down to... Okay, we're at f2 right now. Go to 2.8. Oh, I need to adjust this autofocus a little bit. Sorry, guys. So how does this look at 2.8? Now let's try the f4 that we were at with the Nikon lens. I'm going to raise the ISO just a little bit, and there we go. So now let's look at how these two compare at f4. And I'm sure you know the Sigma Art lenses are quite heavy, so wouldn't really recommend vlogging with this lens unless you're quite strong and you're able to carry the weight required. Because yeah, I'm sitting around 1,000 grams, I believe, just in lens weights with the adapter. So it's something to keep in mind, but looks like it's autofocusing quite well on me. It's doing a pretty good job. Nikon Z6 III, the camera that I'm shooting on, has great autofocus. So pretty well any vintage lens you put on it with autofocus is really snappy and responsive. So that's one of the benefits of buying a newer camera like the Z6 III. Starting off first, we have the 85 1.8G on the right-hand side against the 24 to 120. My apologies, I'm shooting this at 83. For whatever reason, I can't figure out how to get my Nikon Z6 III to read me out which focal length I'm on. For whatever reason, it doesn't come up automatically. If you know the setting for that, please let me know. At these two images, though, they're very similar. But I want to say that the Nikon lens is definitely quite a bit sharper too at f8. You look right here, you can just see all the detail. It's not quite as great on this 85 1.8G. So far, the Nikon 24 to 120 is doing really well. Looking at these two lenses at f4, and you can definitely see there's a bit of a magenta shift in the sky here. The 24 to 120 looks a little bit sharper. All right, looking at the Sigma Art on the right-hand side, we're at 35 millimeters now. And the images are pretty similar in overall sharpness, honestly. It's amazing that this 24 to 120 can weigh significantly less than the Sigma Art with the adapter, but provide just as sharp of images. Okay, now we're at f8 on the Sigma Art and the Nikon 24 to 120. I mean, there's not a ton of difference in overall image quality between these two. Really impressive stuff for the 24 to 120. Okay, now we're comparing the 24 to 120 against the 85 1.8G, and overall the sharpness on this Nikon zoom lens is incredible. Without any chromatic aberration like you see here on the 85 1.8G. Overall, a bit sharper on this newer Z lens. Bokeh looks pretty similar, surprisingly, at f4. I should mention as well, 85 1.8G is a tad warmer, as you can see here. The newer Z lens is quite a bit more neutral in color. Looking at now the 105 2.8 macro, and the Z lens is just doing incredible. Honestly, the sharpness, the lack of chromatic aberration like you see here on the macro lens. Looks like, yeah, there is a bit of a magenta shift as you saw before, with the Nikon being a little more neutral. Maybe it just is a tad warmer too on the F lens. Okay, the next shot here, comparing against the 85 1.8G. Honestly, the images are quite similar. It's kind of impressive. No matter what I've been throwing at this zoom lens, it still is quite comparable, other than some sort of color shift you see at times. This zoom lens, I mean, it really replaces primes, in my opinion. Okay, looking at both images now at f8, honestly, there's not a ton of difference between the two. All right, so the Sigma Art is back in the lineup now, and comparing these two at f4, 35 millimeters. Background looks quite a bit more out of focus at f4 on the Sigma Art. It is warmer as well as the other images. There's a bit of a hint shift there as well. Looks like the Nikon 24-120 is the sharper lens though at f4. Looking at both images now at f8, it's pretty comparable now in overall sharpness, with the Sigma Art being warmer, although the autofocus background is much more clear. Looking at both these at f8, you can clearly see that there's more subject separation on the Sigma Art lens. It's also a much warmer image. Sharpness is pretty good on both images. Overall, both are nice and sharp. Obviously, this zoom lens, the biggest downside with it is its minimum f4 aperture, and you can just see the difference here that 1.4 lens can offer. Obviously, it's not that sharp, the Sigma Art at 1.4, but you get much more background bokeh if that's what you're looking for. You're going to want to purchase a prime, although if you shoot around 120, you're also going to be able to get your rocks off. Okay, now looking at the macro range on the 24-120, overall, it does a really great job at the 120 range. As you can see here, there's a great amount of detail without any focus stacking. 105 2.8 macro is a much warmer image, with this zoom lens having a much more clinical, neutral sort of color tone to it. I'm going to get this brick wall test out of the way quickly. As you can see here on the right-hand side, you have the Sigma Art, and it is a really warm lens in this rendering, with the 24-120 being much more clinical and neutral in its tonality. Sharpness at f4 on the 24-120 is really great, even in the corners. Not sure how much more sharpness you would really want. Looking at the middle of the two, it's pretty similar, with the new Z lens being a bit sharper. Going on to f8 now on both these, I should mention that the profile corrections are turned off on both these lenses. Sigma Art cleaned up a little bit, whereas the Nikon is still sharp as ever, especially for an extended range zoom like this. This lens is just awesome for pretty well everything. We're looking at the weight of all these lenses. The Nikon Z comes in at 630, the Tamron 1.4, 805 with the FTZ 930. The 85 1.8G is 350 grams with 475 grams combined weight with the adapter, and with the 105 2.8 macro, it comes in at 790, but 915 combined grams when using the adapter. So looking at all this, you can really see that even with the 85 1.8G, you're almost at the same weight as the 24 to 120 f4. Okay, back inside now and looking at the 35 1.4 Sigma, I really do like having a much lower aperture for when I'm inside doing studio sort of work. It's just so much more aesthetically pleasing in my eyes, and I really like being able to blur out the background, especially in a place like this. Let's swap over now to the 24 to 120 and let's just see how this looks at f4 and whether or not we can get a decent enough look with that lens. Okay, we have the 24 to 120 at f4 now. How does this look in comparison? Obviously, a lot more of the background will be visible, which in my eyes is not as ideal, but a lot of you will probably be able to work with this at f4. It's really not too big of a deal. You can always turn up your lights if you don't want to raise the ISO as high as it is now. Currently, I have my ISO at 2500 to match the 800 ISO from before with the Sigma 35 1.4 Art. Now let's do some flaring tests to see how all of these lenses perform with the flashlight test. Okay, now the flash test with the 24 to 120, and this is a really bright flashlight. Overall, pretty good flare resistance on this 24 to 120. They really have dialed in their coatings. Okay, we're on the Sigma Art now. I have this to f4 to properly match the 24 to 120. We're going to try out the other two lenses as well. Sigma Art lens actually does pretty good. Okay, we're clearly on the 85 millimeter now. And you can definitely see a major difference between the Sigma Art in terms of flares. In order to share what I mean about how noisy this 85 1.8 is, just have a listen. Looking at the 24 to 120 at 85 millimeters, the flaring is quite well controlled. Seems to do a pretty good job. Nothing too crazy in terms of flaring with this one. Going on to the 105 2.8 macro, and this has a bit different looking flares. They're a little warmer in a sense. Not nearly as well controlled, obviously, as a 24 to 120, but could be really nice for video work. All right, looking at the 24 to 120 at 105. Pretty well controlled. So we're back here on the 24 to 120 at f4. We're going to get into whether or not I think you should buy this 24 to 120 and sell all your f-mount glass, or keep your f-mount glass and just carry each individual prime with you. First of all, I think this 24 to 120 easily replaces most primes after f4. And that is pretty amazing considering something like this is around 1,000 grams with the FTZ2 adapter compared at like 600 and something with the 24 to 120. And you get often a much sharper image with next to no focus breathing, great colors, great contrast, somewhat clinical, I will have to say that. And the colors are more of a neutral sort of starting base, which I actually don't mind with starting out colors with the lens. I prefer a much more neutral image starting out so that I can add more or take away colors if needed. Looking at the autofocus test, the Sigma Art 35 millimeters had a lot of micropulsing, which was interesting. I found that it pulsed a lot more than the two f-mount Nikon lenses, the 105 and 85 1.8. The 105 2.8 actually outperforming, in my eyes, the 85 1.8G with autofocus, which was surprising. It did fail quite a bit at the up-close macro focusing, but that was to be expected because most macro lenses typically aren't that great up close, so we're gonna give that one for overall focusing with f-mount glass to the 105 2.8 lens. Obviously, this 24-120 is the best lens in regards to autofocus, size, overall sharpness from f4 all the way to like, what is it, like f22. Amazing lens, really just can't be beat. I really thought, especially a lens like the Sigma Art 35 1.4 would be a little sharper, but it seems as though it's not. Although I do think the 35 1.4 Art has maybe just a little extra sauce and a bit nicer micro contrast compared to this 24-120. I will say that all the lenses from the F-mount line are quite warm, so that's something to keep in mind if you're wanting something more neutral. Definitely go for the 24-120. I thought this 105 macro had really great character to this lens. This is a really great character lens, perfect for portraits and macro work. And the 85 1.8G is just a little bit soft, but it's really nice for portraits. I highly recommend this lens, especially if you can get it as cheap as I did, only $100 for this one. I mean, how could you beat that? So wrapping things up, this 24-120 is a great lens and it's worth the money that Nikon is charging because it can replace most of your lenses. And I think most people will be able to get away with using only this. I really like the functionality of the 24-120 in its macro range. It is close enough, I think, for most people, especially if you use something like a macro tube. Please let me know if you've tried that. I really think that would get you most of the way to what this 105 2.8 macro lens could offer. And it's sharper. I mean, it's without vibration control, but how can you beat this lens, really? As I was driving home the other day, I was just thinking to myself, how are they going to make and develop a second version of this lens that beats out this 24-120? I really see why people are obsessed with this lens online and constantly recommend it. It's just that good. Okay, wrapping things up now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you ended up learning something from this and it helped with your buying decisions in the future. If you want to support the channel, I have Amazon affiliate links in the description. Please buy through them and I get a small kickback. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. Every subscription helps. This is a really difficult task trying to monetize a channel, and I really hope I can do so this year. If you have any suggestions for things you'd like me to test, please let me know and I will consider doing so, okay? Thank you. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.